She thought she was just saving a pack of ordinary timber wolves from the deadliest Colorado blizzard of the decade. But when 15 massive beasts thawed out in her cramped barn and began shifting into full-grown, battle-scarred men, Clara realized her quiet life was over. One of them was the Alpha King. The temperature had plummeted to a lethal 40 degrees below zero when the howling began. Clara Hayes, a 24-year-old outcast, sat alone in her off-grid cabin, nestled deep in the unforgiving San Juan Mountains of Colorado. As a banished Omega, Clara was supposed to be dead by now. Omegas didn't survive without a pack. They were the nurturers, the peacekeepers, entirely reliant on the strength of their alphas and betas for protection. 3 years ago, after her former pack leader, Silas Montgomery, brutally exiled her for refusing to become his personal property, Clara had defied the odds. She learned to chop her own wood, hunt her own game, and hide her scent. But no amount of preparation could have braced her for the storm that meteorologists were calling the White Death. The wind tore at the tin roof of her cabin, sounding like a chorus of screaming banshees. Clara was stoking the fire when she heard it, a desperate, gargled sound cutting through the roar of the blizzard. It wasn't the wind. It was a whimper. Pulling on her heavy parka, snowshoes, and grabbing her rifle, Clara stepped out into the blinding white. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. She fought her way toward the tree line, guided only by her enhanced hearing. What she found in the snowdrift made her drop her rifle. 15 massive wolves lay scattered across a blood-stained patch of snow. They were colossal, much larger than standard grey wolves, their coats matted with crimson blood that was rapidly freezing into black icicles. They had been ambushed, silver arrowheads. The undeniable calling card of rogue hunters protruded from several of their flanks. In the center of the carnage lay the largest wolf Clara had ever seen. His coat was the color of midnight, absorbing the faint moonlight. He was draped protectively over 3 smaller, younger wolves, his massive chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged breaths. Clara's mind screamed at her to run. As a solitary Omega, approaching a strange, bleeding pack was a death sentence. Her instincts warned her that these were dominant, highly aggressive predators. But the Omega trait, the deep-seated, biological need to heal and protect, overrode her terror. If she left them, they would be dead in less than an hour. "Okay," Clara whispered, her breath misting in the freezing air. "Okay, let's get you inside." What followed was the most grueling, physical ordeal of Clara's life. One by one, she dragged the massive beasts onto a makeshift sled built from a broken wooden pallet, hauling them through thigh-deep snow to her reinforced barn. Her muscles burned, her lungs seized, and her hands turned bruised and purple through her gloves. The black wolf was the heaviest. He must have weighed close to 300 pounds. As she pulled him, a low, menacing growl rumbled from his throat, even in his unconscious state. Once she had all 15 inside the insulated barn, Clara went to work. She dragged every space heater, thermal blanket, and sleeping bag she owned out of her cabin. She lit the large wood-burning stove in the corner until the metal glowed a dull orange. Operating on pure adrenaline, Clara became a frantic triage nurse. Using forceps from her emergency medical kit, she extracted 5 silver arrowheads from the injured wolves, apologizing in soft, soothing whispers every time they flinched. She packed their wounds with crushed yarrow root and bound them with torn bedsheets. The midnight black wolf had taken the worst of it. A deep gash tore across his shoulder, poisoned by a silver-laced blade. Clara cleaned the wound with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the sheer power radiating from him. His scent was intoxicating, a heavy mix of pine needles, ozone, and dark chocolate. It made Clara's heart race in a way she had never experienced. Exhausted, covered in their blood and her own sweat, Clara collapsed on a pile of hay near the stove. She pulled a thin blanket over herself, huddling close to the black wolf for warmth. She knew she had just invited 15 lethal strangers into her home. If they woke up and saw her as a threat, she would be torn to pieces. But as she listened to their breathing stabilize, her eyes fluttered shut. Clara woke to the sound of breaking bones. It was a sickening, wet, crunching noise that echoed off the wooden walls of the barn. Panic seized her throat. The fire in the stove had died down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. She scrambled backward, pressing her spine against the cold wooden wall. The wolves were shifting. In the dim light, Clara watched in terrified awe as the massive beasts convulsed. Fur receded into smooth skin, elongated snouts snapped back into human jaws, and heavily muscled bodies unfolded from the hay. Clara clamped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. These weren't just any werewolves. They were enormous, towering men and women covered in battle scars and tribal tattoos. As they began to sit up, groaning and clutching their bandaged wounds, the air in the barn grew suffocatingly dense with dominant alpha energy. Clara couldn't breathe. Her inner wolf was whining, urging her to submit, to flatten herself against the floor in the presence of such overwhelming power. Then the black wolf shifted. The transformation was seamless, lacking the painful cracking of the others. In his place stood a man who looked like he had been carved from marble and shadow. He was easily 6'4", with broad shoulders, a heavily muscled chest, and piercing ice-blue eyes that snapped open and locked onto Clara instantly. Clara recognized him. Every werewolf in North America recognized him. Dominic Reed, the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. He was known as a ruthless, calculating leader who had united the warring northern packs through sheer force and tactical brilliance. He was a myth to someone like Clara, a god among mortals. Dominic rose slowly, ignoring the crude bandage slipping from his shoulder. His pack immediately dropped to their knees, bowing their heads despite their injuries. "Status," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated right through the floorboards into Clara's bones. "We're alive, Alpha," replied a tall man with a shaved head, his beta Harrison Brooks. "Someone pulled the silver from us, bound the wounds." Dominic's ice-blue eyes never left Clara. She was trembling violently, huddled in the corner, looking small and fragile in her oversized, blood-stained sweater. Dominic took a slow, deliberate step toward her. Clara pressed herself harder against the wall, wishing it would swallow her whole. She squeezed her eyes shut, exposing her neck in the ultimate gesture of Omega submission, waiting for the killing blow. She was a rogue. To an Alpha King, a packless rogue was a trespasser, a vermin to be exterminated. Instead of a strike, she felt a sudden, intense heat radiating in front of her. A large, calloused hand gently touched her chin, forcing her to look up. Dominic was kneeling in front of her. As their eyes met, a shockwave tore through Clara's chest. The scent of pine and dark chocolate slammed into her senses, magnifying 100 times over. Her soul seemed to tether itself to the terrifying man before her. Dominic inhaled deeply, his pupils blowing wide until his eyes were almost entirely black. The air in the barn vanished. His chest heaved as a possessive or feral growl vibrated in his chest. "Mine," Dominic whispered, the word laced with absolute, undeniable command. Mate. The Alpha King was her mate. Clara's blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. Kings did not mate with banished, broken Omegas. They mated with alpha females, warrior princesses who could rule by their side. In the werewolf world, An omega bound to a powerful alpha was rarely treated as an equal. They were kept as pets, breeders, hidden away in gilded cages. Clara had spent 3 years fighting for her freedom. She would not be put in a cage again, not even by a king. No, Clara choked out, pushing weakly against his massive chest. No, please. Dominic's jaw tightened. The rejection, however quiet, clearly stung his dominant nature. You saved my pack, he said softly, ignoring her protest. You pulled silver from my veins. What is your name, little wolf? Clara, she whispered, unable to lie to a direct alpha command. Clara Hayes. Before Dominic could speak again, Harrison stepped forward, his expression grim. Alpha. The perimeter alarms I set in the snowbank just tripped. We have company. Dominic stood up, his protective aura instantly shifting into something lethal. He stepped in front of Clara, shielding her small frame with his massive body. Is it the hunters? Dominic asked, his claws extending from his fingertips. Clara moved toward the frosted window, wiping a patch of condensation away. As she peered into the blinding blizzard, her heart stopped. Approaching through the snow were 24 heavily armed werewolves, but they weren't hunters. Leading the pack, holding a blood-stained piece of Clara's torn scarf from the woods, was Silas Montgomery, the brutal alpha who had banished her. Silas hadn't come for the king. He had tracked the blood, and he had finally found his runaway omega. The howling wind of the Colorado blizzard seemed to mute itself, replaced by the deafening roar of Clara's own heartbeat in her ears. She stood frozen by the frosted window of the barn, her breath catching in her throat. Silas Montgomery was here. Silas, the alpha of the Red Creek pack, was a towering brute of a man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, a souvenir from a territorial dispute he had won through sheer savagery. He stood at the edge of the tree line, his heavy winter boots crunching against the snow. Behind him stood 24 of his most ruthless enforcers, including his lead tracker, Arthur, and his sadistic beta, Wyatt. They were heavily armed, carrying crossbows strapped to their backs. Clara. Silas's voice boomed over the shrieking wind, dripping with a sickening mock sweetness. Come on out, little bird. You've led us on quite the chase. 3 years. But I recognized your scent the moment I found that pathetic scarf in the woods. Time to come home. Inside the barn, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Clara backed away from the window, her hands trembling violently. The phantom pain of her old injuries, the bruises and bite marks from when Silas had tried to force the mating bond on her, flared to life. Dominic Reed, the Alpha King, stepped in front of her. Even injured, his presence was an impenetrable wall of muscle and dominance. He looked down at her, his ice-blue eyes scanning her terrified face. "Who is he?" Dominic demanded, his voice a lethal, low rumble. The mate bond, fresh and volatile, was already flooding his system with protective aggression. "Silas Montgomery," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "My former alpha. He's the one who banished me because I wouldn't submit to him. He kills omegas who disobey. If he finds out I'm here, if he sees you weak from the silver—" "I am never too weak to protect what is mine," Dominic growled, the sound vibrating deep within his chest. He turned to his pack. "Harrison, Genevieve, secure the perimeter. No one touches the girl. Alpha, with respect, we are barely healed." Genevieve, a fierce female warrior with a tattooed scalp, warned as she picked up a heavy iron fireplace poker, the only weapon available. "And they have numbers." "Then we fight smart," Dominic said, his eyes darkening to obsidian black. "Let them breach the doors. We use the choke point." Outside, Silas lost his patience. "I know you're in there, Clara. I tracked your pathetic, sweet scent right to this rotting woodpile. If you don't walk out here in 10 seconds, we burn it to the ground with you inside." Clara's mind raced. Her Omega instincts screamed at her to hide, to cower, to surrender, to save the others. But as she looked at Dominic, a king who had just taken a silver arrow to the shoulder and was now ready to die for a packless Omega he had met 10 minutes ago, something inside her snapped. She was not the same terrified girl from 3 years ago. She had survived the San Juan Mountains alone. Without a word, Clara darted toward the hidden floorboard beneath her cot. Smash! The heavy wooden doors of the barn splintered inward as Silas's enforcers drove a massive log against the iron hinges. The doors blew open, bringing a blinding swirl of snow and freezing wind into the dimly lit space. Silas strode into the barn, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Found you, little—" His words died in his throat. Silas stopped dead in his tracks. His smirk vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Standing in the center of the barn, flanked by 14 massive, blood-stained warriors, was Dominic Reed. The Alpha King's midnight black aura was so suffocatingly powerful that 2 of Silas's enforcers immediately dropped to their knees, their inner wolves submitting involuntarily. "Montgomery," Dominic said, his voice slicing through the wind like a freshly sharpened blade. "You are trespassing on my territory." Silas paled, swallowing hard. King Dominic, I had no idea you were here. We tracked a rogue Omega, a criminal from my pack." "The Omega is my mate," Dominic stated, the absolute certainty in his voice sending a shockwave through the room. "And you will address your queen with respect, or I will tear your tongue from your skull." Silas's eyes darted to Clara, who was standing behind Dominic, and then to the bloody bandages wrapped around the king's shoulder. A sinister, opportunistic glint replaced the fear in Silas's eyes. He realized the king was injured, and Silas wasn't alone. "Your mate?" Silas sneered, regaining his false bravado. "She's a broken, useless runt. And looking at you, King, you're bleeding out. I heard rumors you were ambushed by hunters near the border. Seems the rumors were true." Silas raised his hand, signaling his men. "Kill them all. The king is weak. Tonight, the Red Creek Pack takes the northern throne." Wyatt and Arthur raised their crossbows, aiming directly at Dominic's chest. "Down!" Dominic roared, shifting into his massive midnight black wolf form mid-leap. Chaos erupted. Dominic collided with Wyatt, his massive jaws snapping the beta's crossbow in half before tossing the man across the barn like a rag doll. Harrison, Genevieve, and the rest of the Royal Guard shifted, their roars shaking the rafters as they threw themselves at Silas's enforcers. Despite their injuries, the Royal Pack fought with terrifying, lethal precision. But Silas had the advantage of numbers and weapons. An enforcer fired a silver-tipped bolt, grazing Harrison's thigh and sending the beta crashing to the hay-covered floor. Silas, shifting into a massive, heavily scarred brown wolf, lunged at Dominic. The 2 alphas collided in a brutal tangle of fur, fangs, and blood. Dominic was significantly larger and stronger, but the silver poison still lingering in his system made his movements sluggish. Silas spit down hard on Dominic's already injured shoulder, tearing a roar of pain from the king. Clara watched from the shadows, her heart in her throat. Silas was playing dirty, driving his claws into Dominic's wounds. The king's pack was being overwhelmed by the sheer number of armed enforcers. "I will not be a victim again," Clara thought, her hands closing around the cold steel of the object she had retrieved from beneath the floorboards. It was a Winchester hunting rifle, and it was fully loaded with silver-jacketed rounds Clara had painstakingly crafted herself to ward off rogue attacks. Taking a deep breath to steady her trembling hands, Clara stepped out of the shadows. She hoisted the heavy rifle to her shoulder, aligning the iron sights just as she had practiced 1,000 times in the lonely mountain wilderness. Arthur, Silas's lead tracker, was standing on a lofted hay bale, taking aim at Dominic's exposed back with a loaded crossbow. Clara exhaled. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The silver round struck Arthur perfectly in the shoulder, sending him tumbling backward off the loft and crashing into the snow outside. Every head in the barn snapped toward the sound. Clara stood there, the rifle pressed firmly to her shoulder, racking another round into the chamber with a sharp clack. Her eyes burned with a fierce, golden light, the latent power of a true mate awakening. "Get away from him!" Clara screamed, aiming the barrel directly at Silas. Silas, momentarily distracted by the gunshot and the scent of silver in the air, hesitated. That half-second was all Dominic needed. With a terrifying surge of alpha power, Dominic threw Silas off him. The king shifted back into his human form in the blink of an eye, grabbing Silas by the throat and slamming him against the main support beam of the barn. The wood groaned under the impact. Dominic's hand tightened, his claws digging into Silas's neck, drawing beads of blood. The sheer, overwhelming dominance rolling off Dominic brought every remaining Red Creek enforcer crashing to their knees, their weapons dropping to the floor. "You dared to hunt my mate," Dominic whispered, his face inches from Silas's terrified eyes. "You dared to strike my pack." "Mercy," Silas choked out, his arrogance entirely shattered. "Please, I yield." "I am the king," Dominic replied, his voice devoid of emotion, "and kings do not grant mercy to those who hunt their queens." With a swift, brutal motion, Dominic snapped Silas's neck. The tyrant alpha went limp, sliding to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. Silence descended upon the barn, save for the howling wind outside. The surviving members of the Red Creek pack remained pressed to the floor, exposing their necks in total surrender to the Alpha King. Dominic stood over the body for a moment, his chest heaving. Then he turned. His ice-blue eyes found Clara, who was still holding the rifle, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Slowly, she lowered the weapon, her adrenaline crashing. The room spun wildly. The last thing she saw was the king rushing toward her before the darkness took her. When Clara opened her eyes, she was no longer in the freezing, blood-stained barn. She was lying in a massive, four-poster bed, draped in heavy, velvet blankets. The room was incredibly warm, lit by a roaring fire in a grand stone hearth. The scent of pine and dark chocolate was so thick here it felt like a heavy, comforting blanket wrapping around her soul. "You're awake." Clara startled, pushing herself up against the plush pillows. Sitting in a leather armchair near the fire was Dominic. He was fully dressed in a dark, tailored shirt and slacks, his shoulder expertly bandaged. He looked rested, powerful, and utterly breathtaking. "Where am I?" Clara asked, her voice raspy. "You're in my estate in the Northern Territories, in my personal chambers," Dominic said softly, standing up and walking over to the bed. He poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher on the nightstand and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers, sending a jolt of electricity up her arm. "You collapsed from exhaustion and magical depletion. Your inner wolf pushed herself to the absolute limit to stabilize my bond and heal my pack. You've been asleep for 2 days." Clara took a sip of the water, her mind racing. 2 days. She was deep in the king's territory. Panic began to flutter in her chest. "The Red Creek pack?" she asked nervously. "Banished or absorbed," Dominic replied smoothly. "With Silas dead, the pack dissolved. Those who submitted to the crown were assimilated. Those who didn't were exiled. You never have to fear that man or anyone else ever again." Dominic sat on the edge of the mattress. For a man of such terrifying power, his movements around her were incredibly gentle, almost reverent. Clara looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the silk blanket. "So, what happens now?" "I know how this works, Dominic. I am an Omega. I'm a runaway. I don't have a dowry. I don't have political standing. Kings mate with alpha females to secure alliances. If you keep me here, your council will revolt. They'll expect you to lock me away, to make me a hidden secret." Dominic's jaw tightened, his blue eyes flashing with a hint of anger. Not at her, but at the words she was saying. "Look at me, Clara," he commanded gently. She raised her eyes to meet his. "Do you know why I was in the San Juan Mountains?" Dominic asked. "Do you know why my pack was ambushed by those hunters?" Clara shook her head slowly. "I was hunting a rogue syndicate that has been trafficking Omegas," Dominic explained, his voice thick with disgust. "For centuries, our kind has treated Omegas as less than nothing, as property, as weak. But they are wrong. Omegas are the spiritual center of any pack. They possess the strongest healing magic, the deepest empathy, and the most resilient souls. I know this because my mother was an Omega." Clara gasped softly. "The previous queen was an Omega?" "She was," Dominic said softly, a shadow crossing his face. "My father, the former king, hid her status from the council. He kept her isolated, supposedly for her own protection. She died of a broken heart, suffocated by the gilded cage he built for her. When I took the throne, I swore I would tear down that archaic system. I have spent my reign passing laws to protect Omegas, to elevate them to their rightful status as equals." He reached out, taking Clara's small hand in his massive one. He brought her knuckles to his lips, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her skin. "When I looked into your eyes in that freezing barn," Dominic murmured, his voice thick with emotion, "I didn't see a broken, runaway Omega. I saw a warrior. I saw a woman who dragged 15 massive wolves through a blizzard. I saw a woman who stood her ground against a tyrant alpha with a hunting rifle to protect a pack she didn't even know. You are not my secret, Clara. You are my equal." Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. For 3 years she had fought just to survive, believing she was worthless, a mistake of genetics. To hear the most powerful alpha in the world validate her strength broke the dam she had built around her heart. "The council will challenge you," Clara whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. Dominic smiled, a feral, confident expression that made Clara's breath catch. "Let them try. Harrison and Genevieve have already spread the story of what happened in the mountains. My royal guard worships the ground you walk on. They know you saved their lives. You already have the loyalty of my most lethal warriors." Dominic leaned in closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. The mate bond hummed between them, a vibrant, unbreakable cord of pure magic and profound connection. "I do not want a pet, Clara," Dominic whispered against her lips. "I do not want a captive. I want the fierce, beautiful woman who survived the White Death. I want you to stand by my side, in the light, where everyone can see you. Will you be my queen?" Clara closed her eyes, leaning into his warmth. The freezing, lonely cabin in the mountains felt like a lifetime ago. She was no longer a hunted outcast. She had found her pack. She had found her mate. "Yes," Clara breathed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I will be your queen." Dominic kissed her, sealing the bond. It was a kiss of fire and promise, of healed wounds and new beginnings. Outside the estate, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the northern territories in pristine white. But inside, the winter was finally over. The Alpha King had found his equal, and the Omega who had once been left for dead was about to change their world forever. Can you believe the courage it took for an exiled Omega to stand up to her abuser and claim her rightful place as queen? Clara's journey from a freezing, lonely cabin to the royal throne proves that true strength isn't about being an alpha. It's about the size of your heart. If you loved Clara and Dominic's epic romance, please drop a like, share this story, and subscribe for more amazing werewolf tales.